I know. I just told him it's like a bad penny. Here he is, turning back up again.
Carl, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Yep. Looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have questions about it today, but that 180 to 600 is landing at my studio today. So we'll have that in Yellowstone to test out. Be kind of fun. Alongside the 800, which Charlie Johnson has in the Arctic right now. Although they haven't had much wildlife from what I've heard.
Yeah.
We'll let everybody get in and get settled here before we start up. We got more people coming in still. So we're live on YouTube.
Yep.
We're recording. Everything looks good. Good to see everybody as always. We'll have a few announcements today. We had a great workshop in Newport. We're just going to mainly do open Q&A today, but we'll run through a few photos from that workshop. It was a lot of fun. When we got there, it seemed like the weather forecast was gunning against us, but then it wound up being a lot of fun, dramatic weather that yielded some great photo results, and then also gave us moments to really sit back and edit and look at people's images. And it was a great time. The Oregon coast never really disappoints. So
no, not at all.
Rick, do you have a few things to put out before we take off here?
Sure. So next office hours will be the 10th. Let me just double check so I don't.
Yeah, you said the 10th.
Will be the 10th of October. And what did you say you wanted to talk about? Kits, right?
Yeah, it'll be an open Q&A, but we're going to talk about different types of kits for different types of photographers, and we'll do some chatting and discussion. It's not going to be necessarily brand specific. Obviously, there'll be a lot of talk about Nikon. Rick can talk Sony, and we'll get other people's impressions of that too. If you have questions about that stuff, feel free to submit those. It'll be an open Q&A though, but we'll talk about the kit for the budget minded photographer, and I'll sort of give some of my key reasoning for thinking that for someone on a budget, APS-C just makes a ton of sense and can be a great system. And we'll talk about the kit for the photographer with an unlimited budget that's mainly traveling by car, or we'll talk about the kit for someone who's going light and traveling from point to point, like David Archer just went to Europe and chose not to take his Z9. And we can hear more about that and some thoughts on a great kit for going light, traveling from place to place.
He did take his Z9.
Oh, he did. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, he did. He broke down. I forgot. Yeah, he was.
I didn't take the 400.
No, you didn't take the 400. No, you took the 500 PF, but David's focus is so birds. Oh, Dave Hancock's in the house. I haven't seen you for a while, brother. It's nice to see you. All right. So
a couple of other things. So we've posted, since the last time we posted most of our workshops for next year. The only ones that have not been posted yet are the Oregon coast and Scotland. Oregon coast, we have a date, which is the 4th to the 7th of September next year. It will be held in Cannon Beach. I have wait lists for the Cannon Beach workshop. If you aren't sure and you want to be on the list to get an email when this goes live, send an email to rick@hudsonhenry.com and put Cannon Beach waitlist in the subject line. That's all you need to put in there, and I'll save your name and your email for when we post that. That should get posted before Hudson and I leave on the Yellowstone workshop, which starts
Soon.
on September 18th. Yeah.
Soon.
We have the first print workshop. There are 3 spots left available, and there are also 2 spots left in Costa Rica. And you can find more about those at hudsonhenry.com/workshops. I think that's all I got for announcements and other stuff.
Major news and announcements.
Yeah.
All right. So
kind of hard to believe we're almost done with the workshops this year.
It is. It's we got these 2 left, and then we're going to be going and doing some last minute figuring on Scotland in October. So looking forward to that. And I'm really looking forward to getting into Yellowstone and Moab. It's a great way to wrap the year up. So we got great crews going to those. We're going to see David Archer. It's going to be fun. So, all right. You want to just dive into some Q&A? I see one question from Chris in the chat, and I thought I'd just say something about that we're going to have some questions about banks, and this is a question about the Z6, Z7, older Nikon's pre-Z8 and Z9 and their user bank settings. There are no perfect saved setting systems in any of the camera worlds, although I find that Leica is closer than any. But on the Z6 and Z7, there is no way without sort of nuking all your settings and starting over to switch from one programmed mode to another. That's why I think maybe it's better to just be a manual. All my modes these days have switched into manual and sometimes auto ISO. David Archer's convinced me of the wisdom of that over the last several years. So, and that way you don't ever have to worry about switching. Oh yeah, we'll show some images from Newport. I almost forgot. All right, we had such a great time. I won't take up too much time with it, but Newport has some cool architecture, including the Yaquina Bay Bridge, which we make good use of, particularly on some of the foggier, overcast days. There's Gary Sharlock. Like I said, he just keeps turning up. We had a great time with Gary. This one was kind of fun. We used this as a little bit of an example because we had this wonderful house that we stayed in. Several of the workshop participants, including Gary and Terry and Rick and I, stayed, and we were right near the dock, so we were able to walk around and photograph some of the details and things at the docks. And this is a shot Rick took from this location right here. And then I walked down completely looking at something different and got this shot, just using the colors rippling in the water. So, different people can walk around in these kinds of environments and see totally different things. And one thing that was fun that's always happening in Newport, I mean, if anybody's spent time in this particular beach town, is just a constant parade of sea lions sounds. It's just nonstop out there. They're kind of a constant cast of comical characters on the docks, and so we had a good time with those guys. We had a little bit of fog to work with. We were up in a beautiful coast forest, finding some eerie things to photograph. Rick was shooting down this road, and sometimes. Go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Rick?
No.
Here's a shot of Rick making that image. And Rick was playing around with it. He's new to a Leica Q2 and did some just beautiful work with it. You want to talk through this at all, Rick?
No, but it is what it is.
Yeah, some fun stuff just in the woods. And we went to a great set of rocks called Seal Rocks. We took the workshop out there. We went to the lighthouse at Yaquina Head, which is a gorgeous lighthouse. And there's this wild rocky beach that's like these marble-like pebbles that are jet black. Walking around on them is super interesting. There's lots of different vantage points. Just walking on those black, sort of smooth rock pebbles. We had a great crew. There they are. They're just bizarre. And it crunches as you walk on it, as if you're walking on a beach full of marbles. We had a great time out there. It was, middle of the day, but nice sort of, softer light through a little bit of haze, and it made for some great photography. I've been playing around with DJI's brand new Air 3 drone, which has dual cameras. This is its 70 millimeter camera from quite a ways out, where I was within the zone where it's not bothering the seabird colonies. It's one of the nice things, having a longer camera, you get a little distance compression. And it has a 1.7 aperture lens on its wider angle, which is really nice. 2.8 on that longer lens. And we just had, this is an evening at Seal Rock. We had some nice light that first night, and a kind of a cool blue hour in a haunting kind of place with waves rolling up through. We saw the moonrise. Sadly, the moonrise we had planned to be behind the lighthouse got rained out, but we did get the full moon with us. Again, we worked We worked the Yaquina Bay Bridge a fair bit. It was just a beautiful location. And down on the beach near the jetty, we had an evening with just gorgeous dramatic clouds and fun black and white stuff. Everybody was having a good time. There's so many different things to do right there. I love this one cloud was just magnificent that came out over the outlet. And it just seems like that jetty outlet from Newport is leading to nothing out there. Nice time. This is the new Q3 at 800 ISO. It was an interesting shot because those lights are all green and red, and it just looks a little surreal and Christmassy. And black and white really did something nice for it. Especially the reflections on the water. And one thing we did, we've been out there enough times now to Thor as well, that we spent some time looking at tide charts and wave height predictions and got out there at just the perfect time for this one. It was pumping really well for a couple of hours while we were there, and yet never frightening. You know, I never felt much concern. As long as we were keeping an eye out for potential rogue waves, we had fantastic conditions. And a gorgeous evening at Yaquina Head. I mean, it was fabulous. Some people were down on the beach working with wet sand on a low tide and reflections. And a few of us went up here to get the view from above the light. And then we went out and shot it from a distance at Blue Hour. It was a absolutely fantastic workshop. Had just a wonderful time. I got to jump out of here and get to where I can stop my screen share. There we go. And we're back. So it was a great trip. It was a really great trip. Plus, we had enough bad weather that we weren't just constantly running shooting. We spent a good amount of time going through people's images and doing critiques and doing some editing. And it was a great mix. It was a really nice trip.
And really good food too.
Oh yeah. Yeah. There are some surprisingly good restaurants in Newport. So I'm looking forward to Cannon Beach next year. Cannon Beach has even better food and lots of great rocky, interesting coastal locations and lighthouses and the shipwreck. So we'll have a good time.
All right. Well, I've got a bunch of questions all over the map. Some Z8 stuff, Z9 stuff, lens stuff. Actually, you said you've got the 180 to 600 coming today, and I only pay attention to the Nikon world because you are so intimately involved with it. But one thing I can say is that in all of the workshops we've done over the last few months, that 180 to 600 has been one of the biggest topics of discussion. Rob, our buddy Rob, had a sort of a question that we thought was sort of sums it all up for a lot of people. He says, I don't think there's any doubt that the Z100 to 400 will be sharper, smaller, and lighter than the new 180 to 600.
No doubt.
What I'm really struggling with, though, is this. I have a limited budget. For the cost of a 100 to 400, I can almost get both a 180 to 600 and a 14 to 30 f4. If budget's not a factor, the decision's very simple, but budget is a serious factor, especially if someone for whom photography is a hobby, not a profession. Is the 100 to 400 going to be so much better than the 180 to 600 that you would still recommend it over the 180 to 600? If I opt for the 100 to 400, that could push back my purchase of the 14 to 30. And I think this kind of sums it up for a lot of people. I mean, I do hear people talking that, they like the idea of the reach. Did we determine that this is not going to work with the 1.4 teleconverter, the 180 to 600?
I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to test that or look into it. If anybody does know the answer to that, type it into the chat. I forgot to even check on that. It's interesting. I know everybody's been excited about it since they thought it was a 200 to 600, and it sat on it does from Gary. I'll be very curious about how it performs with that. Ever since it sat forever on the Nikon lens roadmap at 200 to 600 and surprised everyone when it came to 180 to 600. It's a lens that has never excited me much personally for myself, but I'm not that person that it's targeted at. I have the 100 to 600 or 400, and I have a 1.4 teleconverter, and I have the 800, and those three lenses cost orders of magnitude more than this lens. They're smaller. Well, the 100 to 400 and the 1.4 teleconverter are significantly smaller, and it's an unbelievably sharp lens and high quality. It's really versatile. It's what I carry almost all the time. If you're on a budget, I think the 180 to 600 may be the perfect lens for the person who's on a budget and loves to occasionally be able to really shoot wildlife. The biggest problem, a lot of people that get into wildlife and they're new to photography or they're on a budget, is that they've got something like an 18 to 200 or a 70 to 200 f4 or something that's just not got enough reach. And getting that 600 millimeter reach is going to be fantastic. But it is big and it is heavy, and it will make, I'm sure, some optical sacrifices. I'm very curious to test it. Nikon, all their Z lenses, including the non-S lenses, which this is not an S lens, have been surprisingly great. So, I know there are people who've tested it out there that are well respected, who've said its image quality is great. I'm going to test the heck out of it. We're taking it to Yellowstone. I'll take it out with my kids to a wildlife refuge in the next week before we leave too. They've been egging me to go. And we'll see what it does. It's a little big and heavy for me to want to carry constantly with me. It's not all the time I take my 800 out. It's like for a trip like Yellowstone, or Glacier. But if I'm traveling on a trip where maybe wildlife's going to show up, I put the 100 to 400 and the 1.4 teleconverter in the bag. They fit in the same spot as a 70 to 200. Again, I think this may be the perfect lens for somebody who's in that kind of middle tier. I think the true budget conscious photographer should seriously consider the DX system out. You can get so much power for so little money. That kit with the Nikon Z50 right now gets you the equivalent of 24 to 375 for under $1,000 with the camera, and it's a great camera. So if you've got a Z9, well, then you spent some serious money, or a Z8, and maybe the 100 to 400 is the lens you should be looking at. If you've got the Z6 II or the Z7 II and you're really a bit on a budget, or a Z5, well, then the 180 to 600 might be your full frame ticket. It's just gonna require you to carry a pretty big camera bag. And the 14 to 30 is the same kind of situation. It's like the 14 to 24 is such an amazing lens, but the 14 to 30, with its lens corrections that are built in, that are applied in Lightroom, is just as sharp and amazing as the old 14 to 24 that I swore by for a decade and a half in the DSLR and film age. It was just an unbelievable lens. And now, the lens design and wider mount and shorter flange distances allowed them to create an ultra wide angle that's even better in the 14 to 24. But that 14 to 30 is a stellar little lightweight lens with an 82 millimeter filter ring, and it's small and light and much more affordable. So
I think it'd be interesting to see that. As you said, you've got it coming today. So
today you'll hear more from me about it shortly.
Yeah. The banks thing continues to confound people.
Yeah.
I think, Gary asks, when you save settings, do I need to save each bank individually for both shooting and custom, i.e.
No.
8 total saves? And then we had one question that, it's not really a question. It's a broad question, but when you're shooting sports in action, how best do you think about mastering banks? Is it simple? Is it just practice? The
banks don't have to do with any specific style of shooting. So banks are a thing that have been around a very long time. I know David Archer they existed in the D5 and the D4. We had them in the D850. But those DSLRs were so much simpler in many ways. When I worked in the DSLR age, I was almost always in dynamic area autofocus and AFC, and back button, you could use that like like AFS with single point just by focusing on a subject and taking your thumb off and it stops focusing and then you shoot, right? But today's DSLR or today's mirrorless cameras have such unbelievable capabilities for both subject tracking and really accurate single point autofocus. You want to be flipping back and forth between different modes. Dynamic area has become this really legacy mode. I don't know exactly why they've included it, except that people maybe were used to it, but it's not a smart mode. It sacrifices kind of everything that's great about the mirrorless on sensor tracking capabilities that you have for moving subjects. So we get more complicated, and all of a sudden it's important to start thinking, well, how can I use these banks to quickly flip from one style of shooting to another? And the banks are a weird, I don't know what Nikon's thinking. I guess it's just partly because it's what they had before, and so they've sort of shoehorned what they had before into the new technology. But there's certain ways they don't make a lot of sense, and yet you can still use them. So they have their limitations. What they are is a set of bookmarks. That's all it is. You have 4 bookmarks in your camera, and wherever you left yourself in bank A, and when you go back, that's right where you'll be. There's nothing saved. There's no fixed reference point. It's just where you were last in bank A, in bank B, in bank C, and in bank D. So you can utilize that, but it's a little bit complicated. And even more, unfortunately, the shooting banks only store the video recording menu and the photo shooting menu. They don't restore any of the other memory menus in the camera. And the custom settings banks only store the custom settings menu of the camera. And then there are several other menus like the My menu or the setup menu. Those didn't get stored at all, period, in any of those banks. So it's really just the shooting banks and the custom settings banks. And you have to independently manipulate them. It's a bummer. And like I said, if you go in, you set those all up the way you want it, and then when you're shooting on a shoot, you change your settings, it doesn't remember where you were before unless you save those settings. And your saved settings get stored to your memory card, not internally. There's just a number of things Nikon should change. But given that they haven't, the critical thing is setting up your camera in a way you like it to start out. And you have 4 different ways you can set it up, and then saving those settings to your memory card so that you can restore them. You can load those settings and go back to your saved point. The problem is if you're someone who likes to format your memory card all the time, you'll also nuke those saved settings. So the critical thing is you do your shoot all day long, you're changing your settings. Maybe you're working in all the banks. You do some landscape, you do some astro in the middle of the night, you shot some wildlife, you were banging around in your standard mode. You used all of them. All the settings are changed. Into the day, before you take the memory card out, you want to load those settings off the memory card so your camera is restored to its save point. Get your images off the card, put the card back in, format it, save the settings on it again. And make sure you save them to multiple cards and you have one tucked away with your settings saved on it. I wish Nikon would change it. I wish they'd do like Leica, where you save different profiles. It stores everything in the entire menu. You can save them individually. They get saved to internal memory. If you leave you can manipulate a profile and it remembers your manipulations until you leave it and come back and it's back to that set point where you saved it. And you can export them to the memory card, but they're saved internally. You can import them from a memory card. That makes sense to me. And hopefully Nikon, listens to some people who are complaining and does something differently in the future. It works, but it's a pain. They're bookmarks. They're not fixed reference points. As you go changing those settings, they're not going to remember where you were before unless you save your settings at the way you like the camera to start off with. So, optimally you watch those setup videos I did, manipulate them to however you want the camera for your shooting preferences, save those settings to both cards. If you're working with the Z8 or the Z9, if you take card A out and save your settings, it'll save it to card B too. So you can have it stored on both memory cards in the camera. You just can't have a card in slot A to store the settings to slot B. And I have a number of backup cards and I store those settings on every single card. So if I make the mistake and format my card, I can just grab another card, load settings, switch cards again, save settings. Okay. It's a pain in the butt. I know. It's a pain in the butt. And I have a video about it. If you search my YouTube channel for understanding banks, I say the same thing so you can stop it, back it up. Just remember they're bookmarks, not saved reference points. And you can only save them by saving settings, which is different than the banks. It's silly.
Okay. Well, this would be good.
There's something Hudson hit though that bears repeating is you can watch the videos to figure out how to set up, right?
Yes.
And you can slavishly copy how Hudson does it, but get it set up the way you use your camera and the way you want to use it. Because how Hudson does it might not be the same way that you do it. So having an understanding of what you do makes a big difference, because we see comments periodically of, hey, can you post your settings files? And the answer is typically no, because how we set up isn't necessarily the way you want to be set up. It's just the way that works for Hudson or for David or Rick or me, right?
My goal in putting these videos out are for you to walk along with me and go, well, he does it that way. I understand why he's doing it. Maybe I would choose something different. Or, yeah, I like how he does that. I'll do that. It's like pick and choose, but understand, right? We've had people show up in workshops with other people's settings, not mine, but someone else's settings that they got the file from someone and just loaded it into their camera, and it customized all their button layouts and changed. And, you know, you pick up the camera and it feels like a foreign object because it's not my settings and it's not their settings, and they don't understand what's happening when they hit a function button. And these cameras, this camera is so complicated. You know, you've got all these different buttons you can program different ways. The joystick center press can be programmed one way. The OK button can be programmed another way. There's all these different buttons that can be programmed, and different modes can be. You have to understand why you're making a decision about the programming of this thing. And that's why I don't just hand out the settings file, because you're going to wind up with a camera that doesn't make sense to you, and it doesn't make sense to some Nikon professional that you hand it to, because it's not stock, right? It's the way I've come to understand the best way for me personally to use the camera. And you may agree with me on some things and disagree with me on other things, or just shoot in a different way so it doesn't make sense for you. But you do need to understand, you need to walk through and make those changes yourself so you understand them and you know how to go back and change them back if they don't work for you. You know, I've had people asking me about setups for the Leica, if I could share my settings for that. And I'm starting to think with this camera, it's so much simpler. Yeah, I probably could. You know, all it really is about sort of changing the display and whether it's shooting RAW plus JPEG or black and white or what focus mode it's in. It's not that complicated. Plus, the way that Leica integrated it, there's a default profile that can never be changed. That's how the camera was out of the box. You can always go back to that just with a click. Yeah. So I think that, you know, not to put Leica on some pedestal, because there's weird stuff about them too, right? This is the only camera they make that I love. They really did think through a nice system for people to be able to set up the camera however they want and lock it in place and be able to manipulate it while they're working with it, but then come back and reset those profiles to where they were when they originally saved them. That makes sense to me. I don't know why Nikon hasn't done that. Well, and maybe that's a nice
segue. We've had a couple of people asking, you've got a Q3 now. How are you liking it? Jim asked, you know, did you notice any difference last week in the workshop, shooting with the Q3 over the Q2?
It's interesting. The Q3 it has a fantastic sensor. It's a 60 megapixel sensor. It's even more than 63 megapixel sensor. And somehow its high ISO performance seems even better than the smaller pixel in the Q2, or the smaller sensor in the Q2. It did away with some limitations I didn't love in the Q2. You could not set as long a shutter speed and higher ISOs. This one lets me go up to 120 seconds at 100,000 ISO if I want. It has changed the button layout, and I like the way the button layout is better on this camera than the other. It was necessitated by adding the flip screen to the back, and it changed the way that it's got more memory, faster processing. There's still little quirks with it that were there in the Q2. Like, if you turn it on, you can shoot really quickly, but you can't get into the menus or playback very quickly. There's little things. No camera's perfect. There's things I would tweak about it, but it does seem to me like a nice incremental improvement in handling, button layout, and then a massive step forward in its sensor and image processing is pretty amazing. And so it's a great
megapixels is pretty awesome, I have to say.
Yeah, and I was curious about whether they're still using this same Summilux 28 millimeter 1.7 lens, and you're wondering, well, how is that going to handle it? It handles it amazingly. It's just an epic lens. It's great. Yeah, although I will note, with the Q2, I couldn't really notice any diffraction at f16. I did some little tests while we were in Newport, and I will say that f11 is sharper than f16 at 60 megapixels. So there's a little diffraction going on at f16, but
which is not
bad at all.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, Gary said to the Q2 settings, can you transfer Q2 setup?
Negative.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
No. It's quite different the way the button customization works, and it enables you to use almost any menu option for all of the custom buttons. So I'm working on a setup guide for the Q2, and I may share the file because it is just really simpler. The only thing you can do, you can limit which possibilities each custom button enabled. There's 4 custom buttons on it, and so all of them can do just about anything in the camera, but you can limit what each of them can do. And so I've kind of broken the stuff down into 4 groups so that it's not this unlimited scrolling list of things when you want to choose the button to do a different thing. I'm letting each one do like 6 things instead of 40 things. So that's the biggest improvement I think my setup guide does for this camera, is make each button control 6 different things. It's like shortcuts. So.
Okay. Totally different topic. Bruce asks, what should one look for when searching for a monopod?
I have on my website, if you go into the fluid heads and tripods, there's my favorite monopod is listed in there. I'm actually going to update that. I should note to self, I'll update that later today, because at my request, the Leo Photo distributor added a combination of my favorite head with the monopod. I don't like a complicated head on a monopod, and I don't like some kind of foot. I think, a lot of video shooters that work with a monopod, having a foot where they can set their rig down is handy. They're working all day holding that monopod with their video system set up on it, maybe a little fluid head so they can set it down on the foot and do smooth motions. And I see people showing up to do still photography with that kind of setup, and it's just big and bulky and complicated. And to me, a monopod should be simple. To me, for sports and action shooting and wildlife, the kinds of things you'd use a monopod with a long lens for, what I want is to be able to adjust it really easily on a lightweight carbon tripod. And I want a tilt. So Leo makes a really nice little tilt head. It's just got a big knob, and the monopod has a wrist strap. So you put your hand through the wrist strap if you're left-handed like me, and you can get the height adjusted right for your eye and the terrain where you are. And then you pull down with your wrist, and that anchors the monopod down, and you can pivot left and right. That's your pan. You're panning on one foot. You're just twisting on that foot on the ground. And then you need to be able to tilt to get to what you're after. That way you've got a gimbal-like or fluid head-like system where you can pivot on the foot and tilt on the head. So, it's really easy. You can reach up and turn the knob to loosen the tilt. If you want to lock it, you can reach up and twist a quarter turn. That's all you really need, is unlock the tilt, lock the tilt, throw it over your shoulder, walk to the next spot. That's all I need in a monopod. Simple, light, tilt.
Yeah, we've seen some people show up at workshops with very complicated monopods, and a monopod should be anything but complicated.
And I think a lot of them are marketed with slick, cool marketing, and they really are a video shooter system. There are these people who run around with hybrid cameras doing a lot of video, and they want to just be able to hold it like a steady cam on the monopod and set it on the ground, and then be able to do a video movement. So they have a lightweight fluid head on top. That's stuff you don't need shooting wildlife stills at all.
Yeah. Yep. It's the same sort of tripod world. Carl asks if you've tested any of the Leo Photo fluid heads, and if so, would any replace your Manfrotto fluid head?
So I've tested the lighter weight Leo Photo fluid head. I think it's a BV10 or something like that, and it still weighs a good pound more than the 500 AH that I constantly am using and love. And it has some fluid adjustments that are nice, but I can't stand the clamp system that they have, and it's just heavy. It's 50% heavier. The Manfrotto 500 AH I use is 2 pounds. It's the same weight as a Really Right Stuff BH55, and so much more versatile. I haven't found anything yet that could replace the 500 AH as my everyday shooter that I'm happy to carry on my pack. I've been working with Acratech, and I keep bugging them, and they say Scott says he's working on it. They kind of made a hybrid fluid head thing that I didn't love, but I liked some of, and I'd love to see him make something even lighter, that's smaller and more compact. So he's kind of working on that for me. I'm sure it won't be cheap, but it'll be amazing.
I was going to say, yeah.
All of Acratech
that's the other
stuff.
thing about that Manfrotto. That Manfrotto is,
it's affordable. Yeah.
It's
affordable. Even with Kirk's custom bridge, which really improves it. It's not that bad.
Yeah.
And so then I was actually talking with Carl. Carl's been using the it's like the BV20, I think, which is Leofoto's bigger. It's much more like my Sackler fluid head. It's cheaper than the Sackler, significantly cheaper than the Sackler. It has multiple adjustments for fluid tension. It's bigger and heavier, but it's 4.5 pounds. It weighs as much as my entire ultralight tripod in its case, with the head and everything. And it's more than twice as heavy. It's 2.25 times as heavy as the Manfrotto 500 AH. And the reason Carl got it was for using it with the 600 TC and the 400 TC lenses that he has, the big gun new Nikon mirrorless lenses. And my suggestion was maybe try Leofoto's similarly priced gimbal that's half the weight. When you're just working with those lenses, if you want to bring a separate head, I would go with the gimbal for those lenses. So, and it's great. The PG01, I have that in my links too. That's a great gimbal. I have one. I rarely use it though, because the new lenses are so hand holdable. I'm either on a monopod or hand holding, and for the most part, I'm just hand holding for the work that I do. If I were in a blind and I was constantly going to a blind where I'm set up in one spot and I'm not moving at all, sure, I'll bring the gimbal, but that's so rare for me. I'm usually moving around. So,
okay. Susan Rainey asked if you or anyone knows if Nikon's going to produce a tilt shift lens for the Z. She has the older F mount 19 millimeters. It does work with the FTZ adapter.
My great friend John Eastcott invented this tilt adapter for Canon and for Sony that was just amazing, where when you could put it between any lens in the body, and it would sort of replace the mirror box. You could use it with an older, Canon lens on a newer Canon mirrorless body, and you'd tilt. And the way he designed it, it tilted right in that rule of thirds lower line, the horizontal line. And so you could set your subject of interest on that line, focus it, and tilt till the background was in focus. And no tilt shift lenses ever work like that. The complicated, view cameras do. You could work like that with a view camera, but somehow the tilt shift lenses, it's like every time you make a movement, it throws something else out. They're complicated to work with. For me, if it's about focus and getting everything in the scene in focus, I'd much rather use focus stacking these days. I think it's just simpler, and you can do it with any lens in your kit. You just make sure you get focused on the closest element in your scene, and either run the automated focus shift shooting in your camera, or take a series of images at f11 focused progressively further out to infinity and blend those. It's a perfect way to just get wonderful depth of field without having to carry a big, heavy single focal length lens that's complicated to get dialed in.
Yeah.
Shifting is a different
lot
thing.
of practice. It
takes a lot of practice, and you're limited to one focal length, and they're big and they're heavy and they're expensive to produce. And I think that what's happened is Nikon, instead of building tilt shift lenses, has said, we have focus shift shooting built right into the machine. So I think that's where the technology has gone.
Yeah. I had the old Canon, the 24 tilt shift, and it was a beautiful lens. And when you got it right, it created great images. But it was like it was harder to use than a view camera.
Yep.
And much easier to sort of knock off. I mean, just view camera with that big wide screen in the back, really sort of
ground glass and a cloth. Yeah. You can see what you're doing.
That said, there are a number of companies that are doing tilt shift lenses that work with Nikon, Sony, Canon. TT Artisans, I know, has a bunch of stuff. They've got a 50 millimeter shift or tilt, I think, no shift, and a 100 millimeter tilt shift macro, which would be kind of fun. Viltrox and a bunch of others, but it does feel very like old world technology for today. Okay. We had, there's been a couple of people talking about this annular eclipse coming up, and Philip asked about, what are your thoughts about camera settings for something like that?
So when you're shooting, whether it's an annular eclipse or a partial eclipse, you definitely want to be bracketing. And I think that, a lot of people caught up with the idea that with our modern sensors having so much dynamic range, bracketing is just fine 3 stops apart. I mean, I do all of my bracketed work with 3 stops between each frame. Generally, I find in the landscape, even on a clear sun-star, situation, and mid-morning, let's say you put the sun behind a mountain and create a sun star, or behind an arch, moving your camera to the shadow line, bracketing 3 frames, 3 stops apart, and sort of choosing how much underexposed your first frame is, looking at your histogram to make sure that the brightest frame captures at least 2 of the color channels without blowing out to the right, and making sure that your shadow frame has all the shadow details. You can get it with our modern sensors, amazing dynamic range. Capturing 3 images, 3 stops apart, expands that by 6 stops. 1 3 stops underexposed, 1 on some set point that you start with, 1 3 stops over that. With the eclipse, I would shoot 5 frames. When we ran our eclipse workshop in, what was it, 2018, 2017, the Great Oregon Eclipse, or the Great Northwest Eclipse. 2017. We ran a workshop for that, and all of the information out there seemed to be directed at the film age or early DSLR age. A lot of the tutorials and things that I was scouring the web for, and it was, bracket by 20 stops and all this craziness. And I found that most of the images that I processed successfully, 4 frames were plenty from those bracketed sets, 3 stops apart. So I would just say, you're going to watch your histogram. You don't want, in the histogram, you're looking at the data from pure white on the right to pure black on the left. And if you get your camera in the mode where you can see the green channels distribution of color across that tonal spectrum, and the red channel and the blue channel, you maybe going to see the red blow out because you're not going to get every detail in the ring of the sun that's visible. But you want to keep the green and the blue inbounds on the right with that bracketed set, and you want to have some shadow detail for whatever the foreground of your scene is, at the overexposed end of the realm. So you're going to shoot your 5 bracketed frames, look at the images with their histograms. Make sure you got your focus and your composition set before you ever do anything else, and don't change those, and then just be shooting bracketed series. And I think 5 frames, 3 stops apart, and just look at your sets. And you may be able to junk the extreme versions of those shots. But that's the way you're going to make sure that you don't blow it and just have a white ring around a black object. You want to see some of that sun flare coming out and detail in it. And you'll do just fine doing that if you're doing the close-up even. That the total eclipse is unique because you have to employ that kind of technique for the partial phase, but then when it goes total, you can keep bracketing, but you're probably going to get everything in a single frame. Unless you're doing the real close-up. The real close-up, that aura coming around the black disc, you definitely are going to need to bracket. So,
all right.
And practice it. Practice. Go out, in the weeks leading up and partially obscure the sun behind something, the edge of a building, a cliff, a tree. And don't look right at it. Let's remember, even though it's not an eclipse, you still need to not look right at the sun. That's the whole deal. But you can look through your mirrorless camera, put your 16 stops and neutral density on there, and practice bracketing.
Yeah.
And then look at the shots.
Yep.
It's not different than a Sunstar, really.
Few software related questions. I'll just throw them all out there, and we can take them as you want to take them. Okay. Bob Schroer, I hope I got that right, talks about, with current denoise solutions available, do you approach high ISO situations differently than before? Is there a limit to how high you let the ISO go before you simply pass on taking the shot? Bob Lozano asks, when do you use denoise in the workflow? Do you do it early in the workflow versus part of the finishing stage of an image? Okay. I think actually those two we can sort of talk about. Yeah. I'll ask the last one later.
It's funny because I would say, has the denoise software changed my shooting style? It's like yes and no. I mean, in a way, I'm more excited now when I see that magnificent crocodile in almost dark conditions in the Costa Rican forest and shadow at sunset, and I'm shooting at 12,000 ISO. In the past, I would still shoot, but I'm like, this is going to be noisy as hell. Now I shoot at 12,000 ISO and I know, I'll run it through denoise, and I got an image that's one of my favorite of the entire trip, and it looks clean. The modern sensors are so great, even though they're high megapixel. This camera, I got lots of images in Costa Rican rainforest at 12,000 ISO because I needed it for the shutter speed, that are great after running them through DxO's Pure Raw 2, which is what I was using at that time. I think Lightroom's denoise is just as good. I think OM1's no noise is really good. And the universal thing about those three pieces of software is that they are all intended to lay on the very base of the raw processing, demosaicing. And in all but OM1's case, they actually create a new DNG file with that special, interpretation of the raw data, the demosaicing done to reduce the noise while retaining detail. And I've always thought that made sense. I was never a giant fan of Topaz, because I felt like if you're working at the very end of your workflow, and originally Topaz would only put out TIFF files, it can create artifacts, particularly in edges and things that you've sharpened and done contrast adjustments and things on. I'd like to see the image with its noise reduction and sharpening, its base noise reduction and sharpening, before I go through and make all my finishing edits on it, because it's going to change the actual contrast edges and tonality of that image. So I think it makes sense at the very beginning, and clearly Adobe thinks it makes sense at the beginning of the image in DxO and ON1. The unique thing about ON1, to their credit, is that it's built into the raw file that you work on and edit all the way through. It's something that you can do and then go back and adjust, and it doesn't create a new file. You're working on your original file. So
yeah. And that's an interesting point. We had a question last week in the workshop from an ON1 user who felt that once you ran no noise in the develop module, that it was now baked into the raw file. And it turns out that it's not. You can go back and turn it off and use the sort of old school manual noise reduction on that.
Or you can tweak it differently and watch it propagate through all of your edits.
Yeah.
Which is true in Lightroom too, actually. I mean, you have to create a DNG file from your original raw. That's all.
Right. And I have seen, talking about editing, I have worked on a file in Lightroom, a raw file, edited it. And when I got to the point, I'm like, well, I really should run denoise on this. And when you run denoise on a file where you've made adjustments, Lightroom will go back and recreate those adjustments exactly, but for some images you can go back and forth between the original processed raw file and the DNG, and there are some changes, So You know,
Yep.
I would generally do it first if I know that image needs it. So
Absolutely.
okay.
I think it makes sense at the beginning of the workflow. I noticed that Jim actually made a comment about tilt shift lenses and their ability to do miniature style shots, you know, where you only create focus in a limited part of the frame. And I would just say that you can do that with focus stacking too. If you focus stack at a wider aperture and you use something like helicon focus, you can choose a range where that's the only part of the scene in focus. You can do that same kind of miniature work with focus shift shooting too.
All right. Rick Ross asks about a Black Rapid strap. It says he's looking to get one and wants to figure out the best one for him. He's got a Z8 or Z9. He's looking for a single camera strap, like two of their models, but he's not clear on what to get. And what's your recommendation? I know what your recommendation will be.
My recommendation is Luma. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I love the simplicity of Luma's straps. I know there's a wait list, but if you email them, you'll get on it, and they're just so simple and nice. I was a Black Rapid ambassador for a period of time. And it's been a long time. It's been what, 10 years, you think, Rick? Something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
And they came out with the Breathe not long before I stopped being an ambassador. And I think that's the last thing they innovated. It was new 10 years ago. I think it's still what they list as their new product. They really haven't done much over the intervening time. And I still have a number of Black Rapid straps bouncing around in bins in here in the studio, and they just feel clunky to me in comparison to what I used from Luma. I really love Luma's QD loop strap. I'm not a huge fan of the QD that they have, which is the same QD everybody else is using, but Kirk makes a really nice D-ring. If you find that it's hard for you to press the button of the Really Right Stuff QD or the Luma QD that comes with your strap, Kirk makes a really nice upgrade that's not horribly expensive. That's a really nice button and D-ring, and just kind of, I've got that all linked on my site and packs and straps. If you go to ATS links, if you go to hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. I find, there was a time where I thought Black Rapid was just great, and then I tried Luma, and I've totally changed how I feel about it. It's just so simple. I wear the Luma under my pack constantly, and it never bothers me. I was out hiking with the kids up to a waterfall in the gorge yesterday, and I had a pack with my drone and some lenses I wanted to test, and I had the Q3 slung under the pack's shoulder strap. It was my smaller Nye Evo 36, and it was like underneath it, hanging off to the side up against the pack, and it was just super comfortable. I never even noticed it. So
all right. Another Astro question. Jean-Claude says he got his hands recently on a Sky Adventurer. I'm assuming that's a tracker.
I don't know.
He says, I've read that the 20mm f1.8 is stellar, and images I've seen in the Milky Way with this lens was short enough not to need a tracker. I really need a tracker if I purchase this lens. Not looking to do deep sky photography, but mainly Milky Way.
Well, I'm going to just pull up photo pills really quick, as long as we're saying that, and we'll go into spot stars, and we'll say we're working with a 20mm f 1.8, and we want super accurate. On a Nikon Z9, it says you have 4.5 seconds that you can shoot, and that's really not enough. I mean, if you want spot stars, they start trailing at 5 seconds. And the exposure I love with the 1.8 is 90 seconds. At 90 seconds at 500 ISO, which is your cleanest ISO, you'll get a noise-free Milky Way on the tracker with that lens. And that's pretty quick. 90 seconds is a minute and a half, 3 minutes with noise reduction. That's pretty fast. The 14 to 24, which I sometimes use, it's 240 seconds, which becomes 480 seconds, about 500 seconds. That's quite a while to wait for each image. And one of the reasons why I love the 20 alongside its weight and the fact that it just has no chromatic aberration and distortion in the corners at 1.8. It's a wonderful star lens. And so I tracker is just my way of going. I can't get as good a Milky Way image any other way, because I can shoot it at a low ISO at ISO 500, which is the sort of second base channel of ISO for the Z8 and Z9. It'd be 400 ISO for the Z7, Z7 II, and 800 ISO for the Z6 and Z6 II. For Rick's A1, it was 500 ISO, and you said the A7R4 is also 500.
It's the same, yeah.
Yeah. So that's like the ISO band from base to that second channel's base is all about dynamic range maximization. They don't care as much about noise. You're generally working in bright conditions where all the beautiful exposure hides any noise in the image. When it hits that new base channel, they kind of recalculate how they're adjusting the gain on the sensor to maximize noise reduction at the expense of dynamic range, which you don't need doing night photography. You know, they've got little pinpoint specular highlights, and you want them pinpoint with very little noise and the blackness around them. And so that second channel's 500 ISO is actually cleaner than 180 ISO with the Nikon Z9 and Z8 if you're working in dark conditions. So I love shooting Milky Way at 500 ISO with a tracker and that 21.8. And the tracker is not that expensive and not that heavy or big. It's easy to use, easy to deploy, easy to align with the laser. And at 90 seconds, you get pinpoint stars. You know, I generally shoot my foreground at blue hour, move to a place with an unobstructed view of the Milky Way, shoot that on the tracker for 90 seconds, and then just blend them in post.
Well, and for the two Sony shooters out there in the audience, the 20 millimeter 1.8 G is very similar in makeup to the Nikon one. It is a spectacular. This is the one I actually use for my Zoom calls. So, but
you found the 14 lacking a little bit, though, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's a great lens. It's a great lens, but and I've got a couple of great Milky Way shots with it, but it's not as versatile as the 21.8, to be honest. So. All right, I'm going to ask this question. I know what the answer is going to be. Thomas Yeager says he was recently shooting sunflowers at sunset, wide dynamic range, inclusion of sky clouds in the field of flowers and starbursts. He wants to know what your recommendation is for graduated filters to be all inclusive of the three elements of these types of photos.
You're ready for the anti-graduated filter tirade?
Well, let's not be a tirade. Let's instruct.
Yeah. The problem with graduated filters is that you often have, say, a tree that crosses the horizon line or a mountain that's up in the horizon. And when you drop the graduated filter to block out that V of a sunset, you blacken said mountain and darken the top half of said tree. It's an artificial contrast line. It was great in the days of film before we had digital editing the way that we have now. And I was using them up into the digital age until Art Wolf kind of shamed me for it years ago and said, no, capture differentially exposed images and blend them in post. And that was before we had software like Photomatics, which people kind of created all those surreal looking HDR. I think HDR got a little bit of a bad name, and the natural people who don't love that kind of hyper real neon look kind of think HDR, ooh. But that's not the way I use HDR. I capture high contrast scenes like we talked about with the eclipse. I capture one on the meter, 1 3 stops underexposed, 1 3 stops overexposed. Take a look at the histograms of each of the three images and make sure that I've got all the highlights that I want and all the shadows that I want. And sometimes I adjust a little bit. Maybe I'll start 2/3 of a stop underexposed or a stop underexposed to just do 2 stops overexposed, 1 stop underexposed, 4 stops underexposed. And I'm looking to capture all that tonal range in 3 images. You can even do it handheld in burst mode when you get it down pat. And then when you open it up in your software editor of choice, you select all 3 images and say merge to HDR, and you'll get one linear equivalent of a raw file with all the tonality of those 3 images blended into one, and you can adjust the shadows to get all the shadow detail you had in the overexposed images, and you can adjust the highlights to get all the highlight detail and whites that you had in the underexposed images. And you can treat that image throughout its frame as if you'd captured it with 6 extra stops of light capture. Then your already amazing dynamic range sensor, if you're shooting down at base ISO like you should be, captured. So graduated filters for me, for anything but video applications where I can't apply that kind of processing, I don't use them.
Yeah.
I think they do more harm than good in these days. So,
all right. Well, there we go. Another hour down. The next office hour is October 10th. The Oregon Coast 2024 workshop will go live before we leave for Yellowstone later this month. If you wish to be on the waiting list for that, send a message to rick@hudsonhenry.com, and all you have to put in the subject line is Oregon Coast wait list. That workshop, I guarantee, will sell out much like the other ones did. So the best way for you to get a chance at it is to be on the waiting list. And then the Scotland workshop, we will not post until after we return from Scotland. So
yeah,
that will be later this year.
Right. But it'll be later next year too. So
yes. Yeah. So I think that's all we got. Everybody have a lovely month. And we'll see you guys after we get back from Yellowstone and Moab.
Woohoo! Hey, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and all the great questions.